Dobro večer, poštovani dragi gledatelji, dobrodošli u još jedan na jedan. Moj večerašnji gost je izuzetan, Frank G. Gaffney Jr. Dobrodošli, dobar večer.
Thank you.
Gospodin Gaffney je i političar, i pisac, i kolumnist, ali poznat je po tome što je za Reaganove administracije bio pomoćnik za međunarodna sigurnosna pitanja. Danas je na čelu executive director, je izvršni direktor, dakle, CPD-a, tek 4. komiteta of present danger u povijesti SAD-a, a osnivač je također CSP-a, dakle, Centra za sigurnosnu politiku. Hoću kazati, već 40 godina usputa budi rečeno blizak Donaldu Trumpu. Gospodin Gaffney je izuzetno visoko pozicioniran čovjek u administraciji u Sjedinjenim Američkim Državama i naravno da smo našli za shodno pozvati ga u studiju da porazgovaramo sa njime o SAD-u i trenutačnoj i trenutnoj i unutarnjoj i vanjskoj politici Sjedinjenih Američkih Država. Jeste li prvi put u Hrvatskoj?
This is my very first time in the Balkans, as a matter of fact, but here in Croatia specifically, yes.
Kakve su impresije? Bili ste u Dubrovniku u ovom kratkom vremenu, 2-3 dana, u Zagrebu?
I've had the most agreeable time. It's a beautiful country. We were blessed during our time in Dubrovnik to have perfect weather and to see that magnificent city. The hospitality of our hosts have been terrific, and I had the pleasure of spending some time with you last night, which was particularly delightful.
Ali niste prvi put čuli za Hrvatsku. Vi ste tamo s početka 90-ih itekako bili aktivni za vreme Domovinskog rata.
Indeed. The outrage of what happened to Croatia upon the breakup of Yugoslavia was one of the things that engaged our organization, the Center for Security Policy, very actively. And we sought, without, I'm sorry to say, much success initially, the intervention of the United States under the Clinton administration to try to prevent the horror that was unfolding here. So I'm familiar with the country. I have admired its people and much of what it stands for in terms of what I think of as the front lines of the free world, in a way, Christendom specifically. And it was wrenching. Of course, just observing it, let alone going through it as you all did. And I was very hopeful that we would have seen the United States not involve itself militarily, but engage much more effectively and diplomatically early on. And alas, that didn't happen.
Hvala vam za sve što ste učinili u tom trenutku za Hrvatsku i priznanje Hrvatske. Gospodine Gaffney, kakva je situacija danas oko impeachmenta, oko istrage za opoziv predsjednika Trumpa?
I believe that the Democratic House of Representatives will vote to impeach Donald Trump. That's the first of a two-step process. Many people confuse it with the ultimate conclusion. But in fact, it amounts to sort of the prosecution of a case, and then the case goes to the jury. And in this instance, the jury is the upper house of our Congress, the United States Senate. And it seems extremely unlikely that the Senate will vote by a 2/3 majority to convict Donald Trump if, and I think when, the House of Representatives votes to impeach him or indict him, as it were. That will be partly because I don't think the merits of the case stand up to scrutiny. It will also be in part, candidly, because the Republicans control the Senate, his party, and even if he might lose 1 or 2 members voting for conviction and I'm not sure that will be the case, but even if he were to do that, it's well short of the necessary 2/3 vote in order to actually have him removed from office. Personally, my assessment of it is this is simply political warfare dressed up as an impeachment proceeding. It's being brought against him by people who have sought from literally his first days in office to find some pretext to remove him from power. And this is now the fourth or fifth, by some counts, effort to do it, sort of coups, if you will, coup d'etat.
Ako je tako, zašto zapravo se toliko intenzivno od prvoga dana želi Trumpa maknuti s vlasti?
It's a great question. The United States has been, as has much of the Western world, on a slow drift over the past few decades, since I would argue Ronald Reagan left office, towards a sort of globalist, more or less socialist path. Soft socialism, to be sure, mostly, but nonetheless heading left, for sure. And in the past administration of Barack Obama in particular, the pace and the lurch to the left became much more dramatic. But Donald Trump came to office, and you might argue he was a counter-revolutionary. And I think the revolutionaries were determined to stop him at all costs from undoing what they considered to be the progress towards the end state that they sought. And as I say, they've used all kinds of means, some of them, it would appear, illegal, certainly extra-constitutional. And now they've been reduced to this business about a conversation he had with the president of Ukraine as a pretext for his removal.
Da, o tome možemo posebno, ali ja bih to zapakirao u jedno cjelovito pitanje. Koliko zapravo cijela ta predstava oko impeachmenta i ta stvar sa Ukrajinom na kraju kraja impeachmenta neće biti, to je svima nama jasno, ali koliko može naštetiti njegovoj kandidaturi i šansama za drugi mandat?
It remains to be seen. I think at the moment, it looks as though it's more likely to help him than hurt him. Now, again, remember, impeachment is something that can be done by the House alone. That will be seen, I think, by an awful lot of Americans, and most especially Americans who are not part of his base. Some probably are Democrats, but mostly they're probably going to be independents, who are going to look at the total character of his presidency, particularly, I think, the economic, successes of his presidency, and say, we don't think we should be getting rid of a man who has accomplished these things for us over such silliness as the manufactured charges of some kind of wrongdoing in connection with Ukraine. So I have the feeling that in the end, it's going to redound to the president's benefit. And interestingly enough, the question will be most immediately, how much harm will it do to some of the members of the House of Representatives who are Democrats, but they came to office from constituencies that supported President Trump? Well, he may not only succeed in his own presidential re-election effort, but also recover the House of Representatives, because those Democrats will be, defeated for what they're doing to the president over this impeachment. We'll see. That's a speculation at the moment, but that's mine.
Kako vi procjenjujete taj prvi mandat Donalda Trumpa? On kad govori o sebi, ponavlja jedan dio stavova koji se i u Hrvatskoj, iako je ovdje, recimo, kad gledamo ukupnu medijsku situaciju, stvar podijeljena, postoji dosta kritika, ali postoji oni koji govore Donald Trump je učinio puno za ekonomiju SAD-a. On ističe taj rast BDP-a, malo se negativno odnosi spred federalnih rezervi i govori o omči oko vrata, ali i kaže, govoreći da bi taj rast bio veći, ali sve u svemu, dakle, postoji taj rast ekonomije. S druge strane se ističe da Trump nije započeo niti jedan rat. Kako vi pak vidite taj prvi mandat?
You are a very accomplished interviewer. You've interacted with a lot of politicians over the years. Of course, you know full well that no matter how powerful a political figure is, he's not actually deserving of all of the credit when things go well, and probably not all of the blame when things don't. Nonetheless, this president is going to, I think, be remembered for having had a very successful first term in terms of economic prosperity, growth, employment. Those are tangible things that matter a lot to voters, and I think in historical terms as well. The uncertainty, of course, is will that continue all the way through the election? I don't know. I have the feeling that there are people who don't want Donald Trump reelected, including foreign powers, China comes to mind, who would be very keen to manipulate our economic conditions, specifically our stock market, in the interest of trying to defeat Donald Trump. And while you're right, of course, he hasn't started any kinetic wars. He did decide to fight back against China with respect to trade. It's been called a trade war by some.
Pa je sada u situaciji sa Hong Kongom.
He has been, I believe, rightly trying to work on various other aspects of the U.S.-China relationship as well, because, as I'm sure you know, what China's ambitions are to dominate the world, to supplant the United States as the preeminent power. And they're doing it across a very broad front. Trade is just one of the, if you will, vectors of attack. Economic warfare more generally is something that they've been engaged in for decades against us. They've called it unrestricted warfare. And most of us don't even know what's happening. But they've also, in the process, been building up their capacities to do cyber warfare, to do influence operations, to do espionage, to build up their military, to take control of strategic parts of the world.
Africa.
The South China Sea, Africa, the Balkans, Latin America, Europe, you name it. They are on the march at the moment. And I think what Donald Trump has done more than any of his predecessors, certainly going back to Nixon, is to call them out on it and to frame a strategy that says they are now adversaries, at the very least peer competitors, engaged in behavior that is very hostile to us. It's not just about trade, but that's the piece of it that's gotten the most attention so far.
Kad spominjete Kinu, njoj je posvećen zapravo ovaj četvrti tek u povijesti komitet za present danger, dakle, za sadašnju opasnost od koga?
The present danger is from China.
Samo Kine?
And it is a growing danger.
Možete li prvo, možete li hrvatskom auditoriju, a i onima koji nas gledaju van Hrvatske, objasniti prvo kako se osnivaju ti komiteti i zašto je to tek četvrti u povijesti, kojemu je značaj. Tu su razni ljudi, od bivšeg šefa CIA, mnoštvo senatora, kongresmena, moveri, šejkeri, dakle vrlo ozbiljni ljudi.
This is an informal, non-governmental, non-partisan tradition that began during the height of the Cold War, originally in the 1950s. I think probably its most important iteration until now was in the 1970s, when it was formed, and it's made up, as you say, of national security practitioners and business leaders, some foreign, some domestic, human rights, religious freedom activists, subject matter experts, who come together to try to address what I think the ARC would say is totalitarian threats to the United States. Ronald Reagan used to describe them as existential threats to freedom. And in the mid-1970s, he became a member, Ronald Reagan, of the second iteration. And that committee became, in turn, hugely important to him in terms of helping him define the Soviet threat, devise a strategy for dealing with it, and to expose the American people to it during the 1980 campaign. And he ran on that platform of opposing, not just engaging in more of the same sort of détente with the USSR, but really to roll it back, to curtail the threat that it represented to us. When he won office, President Reagan actually invited 31 members of the Committee on the Present Danger into his administration to help him execute that strategy.
Vratimo se u današnje vremena. Ovo je, dakle, četvrti u povijesti i bavi se Kinom. Na koji način i na što vi i koga upozoravate? Ja ću pokazati kako izgleda jedno vaše, dakle, izdanje, publikacija, ali izvolite objasnite na koji način djelujete.
Sure. Just to complete the lineage here, the third one dealt with terrorism. This fourth one is focused on today's and tomorrow's existential threat to freedom, because communist China is actually far more dangerous than the Soviet Union was in its heyday. And you know something about the Soviet era, of course. You've experienced the horrors of communism firsthand. What most of us don't appreciate, though, is that today, what the Chinese are putting into place in terms of their ability to exercise repressive control of their own people and to exert coercive dominance of others elsewhere around the globe is vastly more serious a problem than the Soviets were, for a couple of reasons. Domestically, they are using advanced technologies like millions, hundreds of millions of cameras, surveillance techniques, facial recognition, gait recognition, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, to pull together a sort of situational awareness, to use the military term, about virtually everybody in the country, virtually all of the time. That turns into an ability to engage in something they call social credit scoring, by which they mean they will determine, based on your behavior, who you know, what you say, where you go, whether you violate the laws, whether you violate the party line, whether you will get anything from a job to an apartment to, education for yourself or your kids, or even food. I mean, it can all be used to oppress. And then there are things like the Belt and Road Initiative, which you're seeing right here in the Balkans, that are being used to exert that kind of influence and control elsewhere as well.
Dobro, ali to je manje više stvar unutrašnje kineske politike. Oni su navikli na neki tip opresije. Gdje SAD, gdje Sjedinjene Američke Države prepoznaju ugrozu po sebe i svoje interese? Mislite li da Kina prerasta u silu koja ozbiljno ugrožava ovom policentričkom svijetu, pored Rusije, SAD? I je li Rusija današnja uopće za vas u Sjedinjenim Američkim Državama tehničkim terminom kazano neprijatelj? Ili imate drugačiji pogled na Rusiju?
Let me come back to Russia. What I would suggest to you in terms of the threat that the Chinese represent is they're now beginning to export that domestic repression, that police state apparatus to others around the world. And as they're combining it with this sort of colonial build-out of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is essentially using what's called debt trap techniques designed to dominate and ultimately expropriate the infrastructure that they are building for African nations,
To se desilo baš ovih dana ponovo u Africi.
It has indeed. It's happening increasingly in other parts of the world too, because people can't pay the loans back, and then they lose the assets that the Chinese were building there. And the point is, and why, to come to your specific question, why it is a threat to the United States and to our vital interests is, most of these Belt and Road operations are in strategic areas that are very important to China's desire to project power. Whether it's Djibouti, for example, into the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea, whether it is the Panama Canal, controlling access to and from the Pacific or the Atlantic, whether it is areas like Pakistan and the Indian Ocean. These are, and the South China Sea not least, $1 trillion in trade transits the waters and the airspace of the South China Sea every year. That is an extraordinary thing to be able to control. That's what the Chinese are putting themselves in a position to do. It's unrestricted warfare of the non-kinetic kind at the moment against us, and we have to be cognizant of it and begin to be pushing back.
A kako vidite, spomenuo sam Rusiju, kako vidite, samo kratko, jer imamo užasno puno pitanja, pa da malo brzamo, kako vidite poziciju današnje Rusije i Putina?
Vladimir Putin, I believe, is a man who never got over the collapse of the Soviet Union. He's presided over its reorganization. They went through what we call in the United States a sort of Chapter 11, a bankruptcy, and they've rebuilt much of the old police state apparatus. It's not quite as communist as it was in the past, but it's kind of a fascistic operation. More to the point, as I'm sure you're aware, Putin has long maintained that the end of the Soviet Union was the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. And when you think about it, there was some pretty significant competition for that distinction, like World War II, for example, or World War I. I believe he remains virulently hostile to the West, to the United States in particular, and is anxious to see what he can do to restore Russia to its former greatness, and that he's prepared to do just about anything to do that. I think to consider him anything other than a ruthless adversary is a serious strategic mistake. Just to give you one example of particular concern of mine that has gotten very little attention from an awful lot of other people, and that is the extraordinary investment Vladimir Putin has been making in the nuclear forces of Russia. They have virtually completed a build-out of, by some estimates, 22 different weapon systems, both tactical and theater and strategic nuclear forces, for which there is simply no counterpart in the West. Not in the United States, not in Europe.
Zaista.
The closest thing to it is what the communist Chinese have been building, mostly secretively. These are things that I think we have to factor into our calculations about how much of a problem is of Vladimir Putin. Would he decide to use, God forbid, such weapons? I don't think you can rule it out. Interestingly enough, he personally participates in the exercises of nuclear, simulated, to be sure, nuclear attacks against Europe and against the United States. That's something that suggests his interest in the subject.
Vratimo se malo sa Sjedinjenim Američkim Državama. Spomenuli ste pojam socijalizma. Neki kažu da bi jednostavno trebalo odustati tog pojma i da se radi naprosto o pravednijem svijetu. Recite mi, kako vi vidite pojavu tih, vašim jezikom govoreći, socijalističkih ideja u Sjedinjenim Američkim Državama, kao i kandidata koji zastupaju te ideje? Kakve su njihove šanse, recimo, naspram Trumpa?
I had the opportunity during a previous visit to Hungary to visit the memorial, the Museum of Terror, they call it, which I suspect people here in Croatia have some experience of too, the horrors of World War II, the horrors of the Soviet occupation. Anyone with any familiarity with what socialism actually entails will understand why not only do we need to call it that, I mean, I frankly think it's more accurate to call it communism most of the time, but whatever you call it, it is a totalitarian system that deprives people like yours of freedom. And the idea that in our country today, by a recent poll, 70% of what's known as the millennial generation favor the institution of socialism in the United States and would vote for a candidate who offers that is terrifying. I believe they've done it because they actually have no idea what socialism, let alone communism, entails. And were they to actually experience it, they wouldn't like it any more than the Croats or the Hungarians or countless millions of other people have in Europe, in the Soviet Union, in China, in Cambodia, in Cuba, in Venezuela. Everywhere. It's been a disaster.
Možda oni ne žele socijalizam, možda oni žele i dalje tržišnu utakmicu, samo jednu odgovorniju tržišnu utakmicu koja bi bila pravednija prema radnicima, okolišu, društvu.
That's a very different thing. One can aspire to have such arrangements. I think that typically that can be done consistent with free market capitalism. It just can't be accomplished under socialism or any of the other isms of the hard left.
Koji su po vama, ako odbacimo takove, da niste mi odgovorili kako vidite recimo šanse tih kandidata u utrci za drugi mandat u odnosu naravno na Donalda Trumpa?
My sense of things, again, projecting at the moment, is if the election were to be held today, Donald Trump would win a crushing victory over any of the various candidates, especially the socialist ones. The election in the United States is not going to be held today. It's going to be held about a year from now. And in the course of that time, much can change. And I personally believe that one of the things that happened back in 2008, when there was an economic meltdown, was that it was timed, it seems, to advantage the leftist, Barack Obama, and disadvantage the relatively conservative Republican John McCain. Could that happen again in this election? I think it certainly could. And I think that that is very much in the interest of some of Donald Trump's adversaries to do just that. Could that bring forward a full-on socialist and a full-on socialist program? It seems hard to believe that we would go down that road, but here's my bigger concern, Romano. If not this election, the next, or the one after that? I mean, if this millennial infatuation with socialism persists, it may be inevitable.
Znate da nitko ne može biti dobar konzervativac u starosti ako nije bio leftist u mladosti, ali tako da vas utješi malo. Recite vi meni kako vi, pustimo socijaliste, ako su to socijalisti. Kako vi vidite probleme SAD-a danas? Koji su po vama problemi SAD-a?
Well, the variation on that theme that I've been partial to for a long time is that a conservative is a liberal who has been mugged by reality. In this case, the realities of America, I think, today, despite what one reads in the press, are so vastly better than just about at any point in our previous history. Is there some inequity? Of course. Are there some people who are wrongly incarcerated? Of course. Is there some, economic hardship in certain parts of the population? Yes. But does that justify the wholesale makeover of our society in favor of one that is much more controlled by some central power that is unaccountable to anybody, whether it's a globalist version of the proposition or whether it's a socialist one? I would not characterize the situation in America to be so dire as to justify that kind of transformation. And yet, I remind you, when Barack Obama was 5 days out from winning the election the first time, he said, we are 5 days away from the fundamental transformation of America. That's the revolutionary agenda that I was talking about earlier, and that I think Donald Trump has, to his great credit, helped break, if not actually reverse, and why they're so determined to get rid of him.
Kako vi vidite odnos Donalda Trumpa i današnjeg SAD-a prema Evropskoj uniji?
I don't think he's ever had much use for the EU, and I must tell you that I share his sentiment, actually. Yeah, I do. Well, I think that the EU is one variation on the theme we've just been talking about, socialist, globalist, however you wish to describe it. It is the alternative to a national sovereign entity making policies that are suited to its people on the basis of their own representatives who they trust and entrust with the responsibility for making those policies. It's just a totally different arrangement.
Frank, da li biste htjeli Ameriku koju bi, recimo, Teksas bio snažna nacionalna suverena država, Kalifornija jednako tako i tako dalje, tako dalje. Razumijete moje pitanje? Ovaj kontinent zbog takve povijesti, takve politike snažnih nacionalnih država pamti 2 svjetska rata.
The genius of the U.S. Constitution is that it found a way to bring together people from different states with very different economic, physical, geographic differences under one entity. And yet they preserved the idea, they enshrined the idea of representative government. That's not what you have in the European Union. As you know, what you have in the EU are bureaucrats who run the place. You have a parliament, but the parliament doesn't matter. You have bureaucracy that runs the EU, and it will tell the people of Croatia, it will tell the people of any place else.
Zar Donald Trump ne misli o Washingtonu kao močvari, mislići na iste te birokrate?
Donald Trump does, and frankly, I do too. But the power of the bureaucracy in the United States, I believe, is larger than it should be. But it's by no means, at this point at least, as powerful as it has become in Brussels. That's something that, again, I'm suggesting is the trajectory we're on, and that Donald Trump is trying to reverse. And we're watching. I mean, literally, if you've been following at all these impeachment proceedings, mostly the witnesses have been bureaucrats who have been trying to get rid of Donald Trump.
Nismo vas pitali o svrsi vašeg, dakle, Centra for Security Policy. Evo, pak da pokažem kako izgleda jedno izdanje toga centra. Čime se pak bavite? To je centar nastao prije 2 desetljeća. Vi ste mu osnivači, čelnik. Čime se vi bavite u okviru toga centra?
We work on national security policy broadly defined. It is our purpose, hearkening back to my own personal experience with President Reagan, that the best policy for our national security is something he described as peace through strength. Interestingly enough, that's a formulation that Donald Trump has used to describe his own national security policy. We can talk about the execution of that, but the idea is basically rather than trust in treaties, rather than trust in multilateral organizations, rather than believe that you'll be safest if you're weak, and that somehow you'll just manage if other people are strong. All of those have been very, I believe, decidedly repudiated by history. This is the one approach that actually has proven successful in protecting the security of the people of the United States and, in the process, the vast majority of the people elsewhere around the world. Pax Americana is a term that has been derided by some, but I don't believe in the history of our planet has there been, by and large, some exceptions, but by and large, a more benign superpower than the United States, one that has helped through its own generosity and its defense of others, countless billions of people to improve their condition. And that's what we stand for, and we work through various techniques to advocate on behalf of peace through strength.
Ovdje imam također još jedan materijal, Save Us. To je godišnji izvještaj za ovu godinu o progonu kršćana. Vi ste posebno angažirani, dakle, i na zaštiti prava kršćana širom svijeta. Pa gdje su ona ponajprije ugrožena?
Well, this is another of my hats, I guess. I'm the president of an organization we call Save the Persecuted Christians, which was formed to try to contend with one of the most horrific realities of our time, unprecedented. And that is that roughly the number of men, women, and children in my country, about 327 million, are being heavily persecuted around the world today simply because they're Christians. The scale is stupefying, and what's even more astonishing is practically nobody knows it's happening. So we started this organization for the purpose of trying both to raise awareness about it inside the United States and elsewhere, but much more importantly, to do something about it. And this is not to take anything away from large numbers of people and organizations that are trying to relieve the suffering of Christians, whether they're in the Middle East or whether they're in Africa or whether they're in the Far East or Latin America. Yeah. But it's trying to ensure that the persecutors are held accountable and that there are real costs imposed on them for what they're doing. By that means we think we can affect real systemic improvement in the condition of persecuted Christians.
Gospodine Gaffney, hvala lijepo na vašem dolasku iz SAD-a. Po prvi puta u Hrvatsku i ovaj dio Evrope, pogotovo zbog ove emisije. Hvala vam lijepo na vašem vremenu. Nadam se da vam je bilo ugodno, nadam se da vam je bilo lijepo u Hrvatskoj i do nekog vrlo skorašnjeg susreta. Doviđenja.
Thank you for the honor.
Dragi gledatelji, hvala lijepo što ste bili večeras sa nama. Gledajte nas ponovo za 7 dana u sljedećoj emisiji 1 na 1. Do tada doviđenja i laku noć.